The wind whistled low across the dry plains, carrying with it the scent of dust, sagebrush, and the faint echo of hoofbeats, long faded into memory. Out here, in a small, weathered American village pressed against the edge of the frontier, life was measured by the cycles of sun and rain, harvest and hunger, and the strength of families that clung together through hardship. The year was not so important, for time in these parts never moved like it did in cities. Here the earth kept its own pace, and the people learned either to bend with it or break under its weight. On the far edge of that settlement, past a row of leaning wooden houses and a church whose steeple bell had not rung in months, stood a lonely ranch. Its fences sagged, its barn roof dipped where the storms had bitten, and the fields once golden with wheat now lay stripped to stubborn stalks. The woman who lived there carried herself with a quiet dignity, though the burden of grief bent her. Shoulders more than age ever could, she had buried her husband not a year past, a man who had left her with land, cattle dwindling from neglect, and a silence in the house that rattled louder than any storm. The villagers whispered about her. Some said she was cursed, others that she was simply too proud to ask for help. Yet they all knew she was strong. She worked her ranch alone, sun up to sundown, driving stray cattle, hauling water, patching fences with hands blistered raw. But strength could not fill the hollow ache inside her, nor could it quiet the thought that returned night after night when she stared into the darkness of her empty home. She longed not for riches, nor for ease, but for something deeper, someone to carry her husband's name, someone to laugh in the halls again, someone she could call her own child. In those days, Comanche still roamed the plains beyond the river, their horses swift as the wind, their voices carried in war songs or sudden cries that made settlers clutch their rifles and bar their doors. To the villagers, they were figures of both fear and fascination, unpredictable, fierce yet bound to the land in ways the settlers could never be. The widow had seen them only from afar, riders silhouetted against the crimson sunset, shadows darting across the horizon like ghosts. Yet she thought of them often, more than she dared admit. It was on one restless night when the moon hung pale and thin over the prairie that she felt the weight of her despair press hardest. The house seemed to shrink around her, its silence unbearable. She walked out into the fields, past the wooden fence that creaked in the wind, and let the earth's coolness seep through her boots. Her gaze drifted toward the dark horizon where the Comanche were said to ride. A wild thought, unbidden, took hold of her. What if the answer to her longing did not lie among her own people, but with those who lived beyond? The idea would have scandalized the village. No one crossed such lines, not openly. To speak of it aloud would invite ridicule, maybe even banishment. Yet desperation has a way of silencing fear. She thought of her late husband's face, of the nights they had whispered of children that never came, and of the emptiness now consuming her. What use was gold, what use was land, if she had no one to leave it to? The next morning, when the sun rose harsh and red, she saddled her horse. The neighbors saw her ride past the chapel, past the well, past the blacksmith's forge, and though a few nodded in greeting, most only stared. They did not know where she was bound, nor would they guess, for no one believed a woman would dare ride toward Comanche country alone. But she did not waver. Dust rose behind her as her horse carried her over the open plain, the village shrinking into a cluster of distant roofs dot by midday. The air shimmered with heat, and the land stretched endless and unforgiving. She rode on, clutching the reins with a steady hand, though her heart pounded with each mile. The river came into view, its waters narrow and restless, marking the border between her world and theirs. On the far bank, a lone rider appeared. His silhouette was tall, his horse lean and proud, and even from across the water she felt the weight of his gaze. For a long moment, they stared at each other, two lives balanced on the edge of something neither could name. Then he urged his horse forward, crossing the shallow current with a sure stride. The widow's breath caught as he drew near, his dark eyes sharp yet curious, his bearing calm but unyielding. He was no stranger to danger, that much was clear. When he stopped before her, silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustle of grass and the distant cry of a hawk. She felt her throat tighten. yet she did not look away. The words she had rehearsed in her mind trembled on her lips. Heavy with all the sorrow and hope she carried, "Take my gold," she said at last. Her voice steady, though her hands shook. "Just give me a son." The rider did not answer right away. His expression remained unreadable, but his gaze lingered on her face, as though he were searching for the truth behind her plea. The plain seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what might come next. She had crossed a line no settler had dared, offering not only her wealth but her very future to a man whose world stood against her own. In that instant she knew there was no turning back. Whatever his answer, the course of her life and perhaps the fate of the village itself would be forever changed. The warrior's hand brushed the reins, his horse shifting beneath him. For a fleeting second, she thought he might ride away, leaving her alone with her desperate gamble. But then he leaned closer, the shadow of his figure cast long across the ground, and his lips parted as if to speak. The widow's heart raced, the silence pressing heavier than ever. She did not know whether she was about to be granted a future, or face the sharp edge of regret. The moment teetered on the edge of decision, suspended between hope and peril, with the weight of both their worlds pressing down, and then the wind rose suddenly, carrying with it a wild, unearthly cry from somewhere beyond the horizon. The warrior turned his head sharply, his eyes narrowing, and the widow felt the chill of fear creep into her bones. Something was coming, something neither of them had expected. And whatever he was about to say was swallowed by the restless voice of the plains. The two of them sat there side by side, yet strangers still, bound by a question that remained unanswered. The answer hung suspended. As the prairie held its secrets, the cry that had cut through the air lingered like an omen, stretching across the prairie until even the grass seemed to bow in its direction. The widow's horse shuddered beneath her, hooves restless against the earth, as if it too felt the weight of something unseen. The Comanche warrior turned his face toward the sound, the lines of his jaw set tight, his eyes scanning the horizon. With a focus that spoke of years trained to hear what others would ignore, the widow swallowed hard, the words she had spoken only moments before still hanging between them. Her bargain, raw and desperate, had not yet been answered. But now, whatever force rode the wind seemed to demand its own attention, stealing away the chance for reply. The warrior's horse stamped once, nostrils flaring. His hand lingered near the leather strap that bound a small pouch at his side. She could see, even without understanding the meaning, that he was torn between leaving her where she sat or drawing her into whatever storm approached. His eyes flicked to her again, studying her, perhaps weighing the honesty in her plea against the danger of her presence here. She did not move. The widow had come too far to turn back, too far to be dismissed. She forced her voice to steady, though her chest ached with nerves. "What was that sound?" she asked, her tone quiet, as if speaking louder might summon whatever had made it. He did not answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the distant line of hills where the land rose sharp against the pale sky. Finally he spoke, his words slow and measured, each one deliberate. "It is a call," he said. "Not for you, not for me. For the land." The widow did not understand, but she did not press him. She felt the chill of those words sink into her bones. The two sat in uneasy stillness until the cry faded and the wind calmed again. When at last the silence returned, it felt heavier than before. She wanted him to turn back to her plea, to the gold she had promised, to the son she begged for, but he did not. Instead, he studied her with a long, unreadable look. "Why do you come here alone?" he asked. His voice carried no softness, only sharp curiosity. She drew a breath, her throat dry from the dust of the ride and the weight of his gaze. "Because no one else will help me," she said. "The village thinks I am finished," they whisper, "but they will not say it to my face. They watch my land fall apart, and they wait for me to fail. But I will not give them that. I want more than survival. I want life again. I want a child." The warrior's expression shifted, though only slightly. She thought she saw a flicker of surprise, or perhaps recognition. as if her words echoed something buried in him too. "You would trade gold for this?" he asked, voice low. She nodded, the decision firm now that she had spoken it aloud. "Gold means nothing if it dies with me." For a long moment, he said nothing. The widow felt her heart pound against her ribs, each beat a reminder that she had crossed a line from which there was no return. At last he turned his horse's head, looking once more toward the hills. His silence was not rejection, not acceptance, it was something more dangerous. It was consideration. The sun was sinking by then, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. Shadows grew long across the plain, and the widow felt the press of time. She could not return to the village before dark, nor did she want to. Ride back empty-handed, carrying only the sting of unanswered words. She stayed where she was, waiting, her hands tight on the reins, though her knuckles burned, as the last light of day slipped away. The warrior finally spoke again. "Come," he said simply, nudging his horse forward across the river. The widow's breath caught. She did not know where he meant to lead her, nor what awaited her on the other side. But something inside her told her that if she did not follow now, the chance would be gone forever. With a sharp kick, she urged her horse into the current, the cool water rushing against her boots as she crossed behind him. The far bank was wilder than her side of the land, marked by twisting brush and broken stone. The warrior rode ahead with ease, his horse moving sure-footed through the rough ground. She followed close, her eyes darting to the shadows that deepened with the night. Every sound seemed sharper here, the crack of a branch, the rush of wind, the distant hoot of an owl. It felt as though she had stepped into a world that did not belong to her, a world where even the stars seemed to watch with suspicion. They rode until the moon climbed high, silver light spilling across the land. Finally, the warrior drew his horse to a halt on a rise, overlooking a wide stretch of prairie. In the distance, faint flickers of firelight glowed, scattered like stars fallen to earth. The widow realized then what she was seeing: Comanche encampments. Smoke drifted faint from low fires, and the silhouettes of riders moved like shadows against the flames. Her heart leapt with fear and wonder all at once. The warrior turned to her, his face unreadable in the pale light. "You ask for a son," he said, "but you do not yet understand what you ask." His words struck her with both warning and weight. She wanted to speak, to defend her resolve, but the sight of the camp below held her silent. She realized the depth of the world she was stepping into, a life beyond anything her village had prepared her for. Still, she did not back away. "Then teach me," she said softly. For the first time, the warrior's gaze softened, though only by a shadow. He studied her as if testing the strength of her spirit, as if deciding whether she was worth the path she had chosen. But before he could speak again, another cry rose from the camp below, a shout this time, urgent, filled with alarm. The riders who had lingered near the fire sprang into motion, their silhouettes darting like sparks into the night. Horses whinnied, fires flared, and the peaceful rhythm of the encampment shattered in an instant. The warrior's hand went to his weapon, his body tense. He glanced at the widow, his jaw tight with something between caution and regret. "Stay here," he said, his voice sharp as flint. But she knew, even as he urged his horse down the slope toward the chaos, that she could not remain behind. Something had called her into this world, something greater than her grief or her bargain. The night was alive with danger. The path ahead was still cloaked in shadow. Her heart pounded with the rhythm of drums she could not hear, a pulse that seemed to rise from the very ground. She gripped the reins, torn between obedience and defiance, between the safety of retreat and the peril of following. The fires below flared brighter, voices rising louder, the night thick with urgency. She knew the choice she made now would bind her to a fate she could not yet see. And as the warrior disappeared into the turmoil, the widow drew a sharp breath, her body trembling with fear and resolve alike. She did not know what awaited her in the Comanche camp, nor whether her plea for a son would be honored or cast aside. But she felt, with every beat of her heart, that the answer was near, hidden in the firelight, waiting to reveal itself in the shadows of the night. Still, the prairie gave no hint of what was to come. Only the restless wind carried her forward, whispering secrets she could not yet understand. The widow sat frozen on her horse as the shouts from below grew louder, echoing across the dark prairie like thunder rolling over empty hills. Firelight danced wildly, casting long shadows that twisted and disappeared into the night. She could see riders moving swiftly, their horses cutting across the encampment with urgency, while figures on foot rushed to gather weapons or drag children into safety. Whatever had stirred the camp was no small matter, and she knew with a chill that reached into her bones that she was now caught in it too. The Comanche warrior she had followed disappeared into the chaos, his dark form swallowed by the glow of flames and the blur of movement. She wanted to follow him, wanted to keep close to the only connection she had in this strange and dangerous land. But his command to stay still hung sharp in her ears. Yet her horse stamped nervously, pulling at the reins, the animal sensing her own conflict. She could not just sit at the ridge, not when the cries below rose louder, sharper, like blades tearing the night. She slid from the saddle, her boots pressing into the earth with a soft thud. The air smelled of smoke and fear, tinged with something metallic she could not yet name. She crouched low near the brush, keeping her eyes on the camp as it shifted into frenzy. For a moment, she thought the commotion might be the result of some quarrel among them, a fight, or a raid returned. But then she saw dark shapes moving. At the far edge of the firelight, figures that did not move with the grace of the Comanche. Settlers, or at least men, armed like settlers. Rifles glinting as they pressed closer to the camp. Her breath caught. Ouch. She understood then. This was no internal chaos. It was an attack. The warrior she had followed rode straight into the clash, his horse charging against the intruders with a fury that lit the night brighter than the fire itself. She could see him for brief flashes, his figure rising and falling, his weapon striking with precision, his presence commanding even in the storm of violence. But the settlers were many, and though the Comanche fought with skill, the raid was sudden, pressing hard against them. The widow's heart pounded as she watched the two worlds collide. A clash she had been warned of all her life, now playing out before her eyes. She knew her own people would never have imagined her standing here. Silent in the shadows, torn between them, the gunfire cracked sharp, echoing like the shattering of glass across the plains. Horses screamed, men shouted, and the air filled with dust and smoke. She wanted to run, to escape back across the river to the safety of her crumbling ranch. But another part of her, deeper, stronger, kept her rooted. If she turned back now, she would lose everything she had risked. Then she saw him. The warrior who had heard her plea, who had drawn her across the river, stumbled from his horse as it reared. A shot had struck near him, and though he moved quickly, she saw the weakness in his stride. He did not fall, but he faltered, enough for danger to press close. Without thinking, she moved. She darted down the slope, her skirts catching on brush, her boots slipping on the rough earth. The air burned in her lungs, but she did not stop until she reached the edge of the firelight, where the chaos surged around her. A man turned suddenly toward her, a settler, rifle lifted. For a heartbeat she thought he would shoot her where she stood. But his eyes widened, confusion flashing across his face as he recognized her not as an enemy, but as one of his own kind. He hesitated, his weapon wavering. She took the chance and threw herself toward the warrior, her hands grasping his arm to steady him. He glanced at her with a flicker of surprise, but there was no time for words. Together, they pressed toward the shadows, away from the line of fire, though danger followed close at their heels. The fight raged long into the night, and though she and the warrior found cover behind a low ridge, the sounds of it filled the air, the crack of rifles, the shouts of men, the cries of the wounded. She pressed her back against the earth, trembling, her hand still gripping his arm, as though letting go would shatter her resolve. When at last the gunfire faded and the shouts scattered into silence, the camp lay scarred by the raid. Fires smoldered, smoke curled into the night, and the moans of the injured rose where victory had not come. The settlers had pulled back, but the damage was done. The widow could see women carrying children through the wreckage, men tending to wounds, horses, standing bloodied and restless. The warrior rose slowly, his chest rising heavy with breath. He was not broken, though the weariness in his eyes spoke of the toll the fight had taken. He glanced at her again, his gaze unreadable, but softer now, as though her presence had shifted something he had not expected. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "I could not leave," she answered. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Neither of them dared to speak further. In the days that followed, the widow found herself drawn into the life of the camp, not as an outsider, watching from afar, but as someone swept into their struggle. She saw the cost of the raid, the wounded laid out on blankets, the quiet grief of families who had lost, the sharp determination of those who prepared for the next. The Comanche did not speak to her freely. Not yet. But they did not cast her out either. Her presence was tolerated, perhaps because she had stood beside one of their warriors in the heat of danger. The warrior himself moved among his people with a steady calm, his authority unspoken yet clear. She learned, in whispers from those around the fires, that he was not merely a fighter, but a leader, bound by responsibility that stretched beyond himself. And she understood then why her plea had weighed so heavily upon him. To take her bargain would not simply be a matter of gold. It would mean stepping into a tangle of worlds, binding his fate to hers in ways neither village nor camp would easily accept. Yet still the widow did not waver. Each night, as she lay awake beneath the foreign stars, she felt the hollow ache inside her grow sharper, the longing for a child pressing stronger than the fear of judgment. The conflict deepened with each passing day. Her village would soon hear whispers of the raid, whispers that might name her absence as betrayal. And here, among the Comanche, trust was not given lightly. She stood balanced between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, yet desperate for something that might tie her to life again at times. She caught sight of the warrior watching her from across the campfire, his gaze steady, his thoughts hidden. She wondered if he still weighed her words, still considered whether her plea was a desperate folly or a truth that might shape both their futures. But the land gave no answers. Only the restless wind carried the unspoken questions forward as the plains stretched endless and uncertain, holding their secrets close. And though she had stepped deeper into this world, the widow knew the true test had yet to come. For the raid was only the beginning, and the shadow of greater conflict loomed just beyond the horizon. The nights that followed the raid were restless ones, filled with the smoke of damp fires and the low hum of voices that never seemed to fade. The widow lay beneath the open sky, a borrowed blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, listening to the sounds of the Comanche camp. Horses shifted and snorted in the distance, their silhouettes black against the pale light of the moon. Children cried softly in their sleep, comforted by mothers whose own faces carried the sharp lines of exhaustion. Men spoke in low tones, planning what would come next. She felt the weight of all of it pressing on her. She had asked for something deeply personal, but now she found herself woven into a conflict that reached far beyond her own desires. The raid had not been a single strike. It was a warning of more to come. The settlers would not stop. Their rifles had already spoken once, and soon they would speak again. The warrior she had followed across the river was never still. Each morning, before the sun rose, she saw him with the others, checking the horses, sharpening weapons, speaking with quiet authority that drew the people close. His presence was a steady force in the chaos, yet she could see the strain etched around his eyes. He carried responsibility heavier than any gold she could offer. When he looked at her, it was not with anger, nor with welcome. It was something in between, a watchfulness, a constant measuring of whether she belonged here at all. She had saved him from stumbling in the fight, but she also represented danger. To him, to his people, and to herself. The widow spent her days moving among the camp, offering what little help she could. She carried water, tended fires, and cared for the wounded when allowed. She learned words slowly, simple ones, offered by the children who were less guarded than their elders. Still, she remained an outsider, tolerated, but not embraced. Whispers followed her when she passed, but she could not understand their full meaning. But at night, when the fires burned low and shadows stretched long, her thoughts returned always to the same ache. Her plea for a child had not been answered, nor rejected. It lingered, a promise half-formed, waiting on the lips of the warrior who had yet to give her his choice. The silence between them grew heavier with each day. Even as the tension outside the camp sharpened, word came that the settlers were gathering again. Scouts returned with reports of wagons moving in groups, rifles stacked high, men muttering about revenge. The village across the river, the one she had left, was no longer untouched.
Oh.
The settlers there spoke her name in hushed voices, wondering if she had betrayed them. Some claimed they had seen her during the raid, though in the smoke and confusion, no one could be sure. Suspicion spread quickly, as it always did, and the widow knew that if she tried to return now, she might be met not with welcome, but with cold steel. Her heart twisted with fear, but also with defiance. She had made her choice the moment she crossed the river. There was no going back. One evening, as the camp prepared for what they knew must come, the warrior approached her. His face was solemn, the lines of duty pressed into his skin. "Your people will come again," he said, his voice steady, but low. "And they will bring more than before." She nodded, her throat tight. "I know you are still of them," he said. "When the fight begins, they may spare you. Good return." The words struck her with a force she hadn't expected. Turn to what? To a house stripped of warmth? To whispers of betrayal? 2 nights spent in emptiness? She shook her head, her voice breaking. "There is nothing left for me there." He studied her carefully, his dark eyes narrowing with thought. For a moment, it seemed he might speak of her plea, might finally give answer to the words she had spoken when they first met. But instead, he turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the last of the sun dipped low. "Then you were caught between," he said. "Not theirs, it's not ours. That is the most dangerous place of all." The widow wanted to cry out, to tell him she would choose. She had already chosen, but the weight of his words left her silent. She felt suspended, as if the whole of her life hung on a thin thread stretched between 2 worlds, one that could snap with the smallest pull. As the days passed, preparations grew heavier. The camp moved with urgency, shifting supplies, scouting routes, tightening defenses. At night, fires burned lower, voices hushed to whispers. Every sound in the dark, every rustle of grass, every cry of a night bird felt like a warning. The widow felt the tension coil inside her, a steady tightening that left her restless. She could not eat without tasting ash. She could not sleep without waking in fear. She began to notice small things, the way the horses stamped uneasily, the way the warrior's eyes lingered longer on the horizon, the way mothers clutched their children tighter at night. The whole camp seemed to breathe in short, sharp gasps, waiting for something none could stop. One night, as she stood near the edge of the camp, she saw the warrior again, his figure tall against the firelight. He was speaking with the elders, their faces grim, their words too low for her to hear. When they parted, he lingered alone, staring into the darkness beyond. She stepped closer, her heart pounding, and spoke softly. "You haven't answered me," she said. His gaze shifted to her, steady and unflinching. "There has been no time for such things." Her voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "Time is always passing. If not now, then when? I gave you my gold. I gave you my truth. Do I not deserve yours?" The firelight flickered across his face, casting shadows that deepened the lines of his expression. He did not look away, but his silence stretched long. At last he said, "You ask for more than gold can buy. A son is not a trade. It is blood. It is life. It binds all you. Ready for what that means?" The widow's chest tightened. Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to say yes, to speak it without hesitation. But before the word could leave her lips, a sharp cry cut through the camp. A scout had returned, breathless, his voice carrying urgency that sent the people rushing from their fires. The settlers were near. The camp burst into movement, shadows flying in every direction. Horses were drawn, weapons raised, fires doused. The widow's heart thundered in her chest as she turned toward the ridge, where in the distance faint flickers of lanterns marked the approach of her old world. The warrior stood at her side, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. His voice was calm, though his eyes burned with fire. "It begins," she trembled, her body torn between fear and resolve. This was the moment she had dreaded, the storm that had loomed since the night of the raid. She stood on the edge of it, now caught between two forces that would not yield. The cries grew louder, the settlers' lanterns spreading like fire across the horizon. Horses thundered in the dark, their hooves pounding against the earth with the force of a storm. The Comanche stood ready, their silhouettes sharp against the dying firelight. Faces set with fierce determination, the widow gripped her hands together, her mind racing with questions that offered no answer. Would the warrior stand with her? Would he honor her plea? Or would the coming fight tear apart the fragile thread that bound them? Would her own people see her as enemy, striking her down before she could speak a word? The night thickened with the weight of what was to come. Smoke clung low, the ground trembled with the march of boots. The wind carried the bitter edge of fear, and as the two worlds hurtled toward collision, the widow stood in the heart of it, her soul caught in the space between hope and ruin. The battle had not yet begun, but already the air cracked with the promise of it. The climax of her journey pressed close, unseen but inevitable, waiting just beyond the veil of night. The night broke open with the crack of rifles. The settlers came fast, lanterns swaying, boots thundering against the hard earth, their shouts carrying across the prairie like jagged lightning. The Comanche answered with their own cries, voices sharp and unyielding, rising above the storm. Horses surged forward, shadows twisting together in the smoke and dust. And the widow felt herself pulled into the very heart of the clash. She had no weapon in her hands, only her breath and her pounding heart. She pressed close to the fire's dying glow, her body trembling as she watched the two worlds strike against each other. Rifles fired, arrows flew, blades clashed, and the night was alive with the roar of battle. She wanted to shut her eyes, to block out the chaos, but she could not. Every sound carried meaning. Every figure carried the weight of a life she had somehow been tied to. The warrior was there, tall and unyielding, his horse charging into the press of settlers. He fought with precision, his movements swift and sharp, every strike guided by something deeper than anger. She watched him from the edge, fear rising with every breath. He was the anchor she had clung to since stepping into this world, and now he was swallowed by the storm. The settlers pushed hard, their numbers pressing the camp back toward the ridge. Smoke stung her eyes, the acrid taste of gunpowder thick in her throat. She saw faces she knew, among them men from her village, men who had once nodded to her in passing or spoken kind words after her husband's death. Now their eyes burned with suspicion and fury, rifles raised not only at the Comanche but at her. One man pointed, shouting her name above the din. His voice carried like a blade, cutting through the smoke. Others turned their heads, their faces twisting as they caught sight of her. She saw recognition flash, then confusion, then anger. Betrayal, they would call it. Standing here, she was no longer one of them. Fear gripped her, but she did not move. She ran. She would only prove their whispers true. She stayed. She might yet show them she had chosen something beyond their narrow world. She held her ground, even as the air shook with gunfire. The warrior broke through the line, his horse crashing into the circle where she stood. He swung down in a blur, his hand closing around her arm. "Come," he said, his voice a command. Cut from stone, she followed, her body moving before her mind could resist. Together they pressed away from the settler's gaze, weaving through the chaos toward the shadows of the ridge. The noise behind them grew louder, the clash of two worlds. Locking tighter, but he did not slow. His grip was firm, guiding her forward until they reached the safety of the rocks. There, in the brief shelter, he turned to her, his breath heavy, his eyes burning with urgency. "This fight will not end tonight," he said. "But you must. Choose where you belong." Her chest ached, her throat raw with dust and fear. She thought of the ranch, the empty rooms, the way the village had turned cold when her husband's grave grew old. She thought of the Comanche camp, scarred by raids, but alive with voices that carried strength even in grief. She thought of her plea for a son, of the life she longed for, of the future that might yet rise from the ashes of the past. Her voice trembled, but she spoke with all the truth she had left. I have chosen. I belong here, with you. For a long moment, he searched her face, as if testing the weight of her words. The battle still raged behind them, shouts rising. The night lit by sparks and flame, but in that small space, everything else seemed to fall silent. At last, he gave a single nod, his hand still holding hers. Then you will walk this path, and it will not be an easy one. I know, she whispered, but I will not turn back. They returned to the fight, not as strangers bound by chance, but as two lives entwined by choice. The settlers pressed hard, but the Comanche fought with the strength of the land itself. By dawn, when the light of morning spread across the prairie, the battle had broken apart. The settlers retreated, their wagons rolling back toward the river, their rifles lowered. The Comanche stood, battered but unbroken. The camp scarred, but still alive. The widow watched as the fires were rebuilt, as the wounded were tended, as the cries of mourning rose and fell in the morning air. She felt the sorrow of loss press heavy around her, but beneath it, she felt something stronger, resilient. They had endured, and so had she. In the days that followed, whispers shifted. Where once she had been the outsider, the one watched with suspicion, she was now the woman who had stood in the storm and not run. Some still looked at her with doubt, but others began to see her not as a stranger, but as someone willing to carry their burdens. She worked beside them, carrying water, tending wounds, sharing in the rhythm of their survival. The warrior spoke little of the future, but his presence grew closer. In quiet moments, she caught his gaze and felt the weight of his unspoken words. He had not promised her a son outright, but she knew now that her plea was not dismissed. It lived between them, shaped not only by gold or desperation, but by the bond forged in fire and blood. One evening, as the sun set over the endless prairie, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, the widow stood beside him. The land stretched wide before them, scarred yet beautiful, alive with the promise of seasons yet to come. He spoke softly, his voice carrying the strength of truth. What you asked is not only for you. It will bind us both. It will bind our worlds. Are you ready for that weight? She turned her eyes to him, steady now, no longer trembling with doubt. I am ready. I do not want to stand between anymore. I want to stand with. Gave no grand reply, only a slow nod, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Thought. But in that simple gesture, she felt the answer she had long waited for. The widow knew the road ahead would not be easy. The settlers would not forget, and the Comanche would not forgive easily. She would always carry the mark of two worlds, never fully belonging to one, but she no longer feared it. She had chosen her place, chosen her path, chosen to seek life where others saw only ruin. The wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of earth and fire. The sound of horses moving in the distance, the low hum of voices rising from the camp. The widow breathed it in, her heart steady for the first time in years. Her journey had begun with loss. With grief so deep it had hollowed her from within, it had carried her across a river into fire and battle, into the heart of a world she'd had once been taught to fear. Now it ended not with certainty, but with possibility of future that might yet hold the child she longed for, the life she had thought forever lost. As the last light of day slipped below the horizon, she felt the truth settle deep within her. Gold had brought her here, but it was not gold that would carry her forward. It was choice, it was courage. It was the bond between hearts strong enough to withstand the storm. And with that, the widow stepped into the new night, no longer begging, no longer broken, but ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. When dawn finally settled over the plains, the world seemed washed clean, though the scars of the night remained. Smoke rose in thin threads from the campfires, and the smell of gunpowder clung to the air. The Comanche camp stood bruised but unbroken. Some faces were missing, and the cries of grief echoed softly among the lodges, yet life moved forward with the strength of those who had endured. The settlers had withdrawn across the river, their wagons dragging shadows behind them as they retreated toward the safety of their town. The widow knew their departure was not forgiveness, only pause. Their anger would not vanish in a single night. The whispers about her, about where she stood and who she stood with, would grow sharper with time. She felt the truth of it deep. In her chest, she had crossed a line she could never uncross. But as she walked through the camp, helping to carry water for the wounded and bread for the weary, she felt something else to acceptance, slow and cautious but real. Eyes that had once looked past her now met her with quiet recognition. Hands that had kept their distance now brushed hers as they passed supplies. She was still marked as an outsider. She was no longer a stranger. The warrior moved among his people with calm authority, speaking with the elders, tending to the horses, watching the horizon with steady eyes. Yet in quiet moments, when their paths crossed, his gaze lingered on her. He said little, but the silence between them no longer held. Only doubt it carried a weight that felt almost like promise. One evening, as the sky burned gold and the prairie stretched endless before them, she sat near the river with him. The water moved slow, reflecting the fading light, and the land seemed at peace, though the memory of battle still lived in the soil. She broke the silence first, her voice low. "I know my people will not forget. They'll not forgive me for standing here?" He nodded once, his eyes steady on the horizon. "Mine will not forget either. But what matters is where you stand when the storm comes again." She looked at him, the question rising in her heart, the same one she had carried since the night she begged him to hear her. "And where will you stand? With me?" For a moment, he did not answer. The river moved between them, quiet and constant. Then he turned to her, his voice calm but certain. "You came with gold. You asked for a son. But you stayed for something more than either. You stayed for life. If you can carry the weight of both worlds, then I will stand with you." Her breath caught, her heart trembling with relief and fear alike. She knew his words were not a promise of ease, but a vow of truth. To walk with him would mean struggle, judgment, hardship, but it would also mean belonging, not to one world or the other, but to the bond they would make together. The days stretched into weeks, and slowly the wounds of the camp began to heal. Children's laughter returned, faint but real, carried on the wind. The horses grew restless again, eager for the long rides of open prairie. The elders spoke of caution, of watching the settlers closely, of bracing for the next strike. They also spoke of strength, of unity, of the land that bound them together. The widow's ranch across the river remained silent, its fields untended, its walls standing empty. Sometimes at night, she thought of it of the quiet rooms of the life that had once been hers. But the thought no longer hollowed her. It was part of her past, not her future. Her place was here now, by fires that still burned, by voices that still carried hope through the night. In time, the whispers about her shifted. She was no longer the woman who had begged for a son in desperation. She was the woman who had crossed a river and chosen a path against all odds. The camp spoke her, named differently, some with curiosity, some with respect. And though not all accepted her fully, she no longer felt invisible. The warrior remained her anchor, his presence steady, his gaze always carrying the weight of choice. They spoke often now, not only of survival, but of what might come after. He told her stories of the land, of the hunts and the songs, of the spirits that moved in the wind. She shared her own memories of the small house and the fields, of a life that had once seemed enough, but now felt like only a shadow of what could be. And one night, as the stars stretched wide above them, he spoke the words she had longed to hear. "If a son comes, he will carry both our blood. He will walk to paths, and it will not be easy, but he will know strength, he will know belonging." Tears stung her eyes, not of sorrow, but of release. The plea she had carried, the bargain she had offered, had become something greater. It was no longer about gold, no longer about desperation. It was about life rising from ruin, about hope found in the unlikeliest of places. The seasons turned slowly, the prairie shifting from the heat of summer to the cool winds of autumn. The widow worked beside the people she had once feared, her hands calloused, her heart steadier than it had ever been. She felt the land take root in her again, not as something to survive upon, but as something to live within. When she thought of her old village, it was with a strange mix of sorrow and peace. She knew she would never return, and she no longer wished to. They had cast her aside, and she had found a life stronger than their whispers. Her name would linger in their stories, twisted into betrayal, but here, across the river, it carried a different meaning, resilience, choice, belonging. As the year drew on, the Comanche camp grew stronger, rebuilding what had been lost, preparing for what might still come. The settlers did not return in force, though the horizon was always watched with wary eyes. The widow knew peace was fragile. She also knew she was no longer afraid of the storm. One morning, as the sun rose over the wide prairie, she stood beside the warrior, their hands joined. The land stretched endless before them, scarred but beautiful, alive with promise. She felt the weight of her journey settle into her bones, not as a burden, but as truth. She had crossed from loss into life, from grief into hope, from emptiness into belonging. Her story was no longer one of desperation. It was one of choice, of courage, of finding strength where none had seemed possible. She had begged once for a son, thinking gold could buy what her heart lacked. But what she had found was greater, a bond forged in fire, life rebuilt from ashes, a future that carried both her past and her hope forward. As the wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of earth and smoke, she breathed deeply, her heart steady. The river that once divided her from life now marked the path she had chosen. She would not return. She would not falter. She would carry her story forward, a story of love, of survival, of belonging. And with that, the widow stepped into the day, her heart no longer bound by grief, but open to the life she had chosen, ready to walk the path ahead with courage, hope, and the promise of a future strong enough to withstand whatever storms might come.